I sat alone at a table set for 10 on my 23rd birthday, while the pitying stares of the waitstaff burned holes into my back. When my phone finally rang, I foolishly thought my family was just running late in Atlanta traffic. Instead, my mother casually told me to pay the massive cancellation fee myself and catch a bus home because my sister's new boyfriend had a flat tire. I paid the bill with my very last dollar, walked out into the freezing rain, and vanished from their lives completely. 7 years later, they invited me to a wedding, having no idea they were sending the invitation to their primary creditor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace. My name is Zuri, and I am 35 years old today. But to understand how I built an empire, you have to understand the exact night I lost everything I thought I wanted. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The air in Atlanta was crisp, carrying the promise of a heavy downpour. I was sitting inside one of Buckhead's most exclusive steakhouses, the kind of place with velvet booths, dim ambient lighting, and waiters who wear crisp white jackets and speak in hushed, respectful tones. I had saved up for months working overtime at a soul-crushing administrative job just to buy a beautiful emerald green silk dress for the occasion. I was turning 23. It was supposed to be my golden year, the year I finally proved I was a competent adult, worthy of my family's respect. I had arrived 20 minutes early to ensure everything was perfect. The hostess had led me to a massive round table right in the center of the main dining room. 10 empty chairs surrounded me. 10 pristine white napkins folded into perfect swans, 10 crystal water glasses catching the light from the chandeliers above. I sat there for the first 30 minutes feeling nothing but hopeful anticipation. My parents, Andre and Valerie, were always deeply concerned with appearances. They loved being seen in places like this, mingling with Atlanta's elite, showing off their designer clothes and flashing their country club smiles. I assumed they were just delayed by the infamous city traffic. But as the clock ticked past the 1-hour mark, the isolation began to suffocate me. The restaurant was filling up rapidly with laughing couples and celebrating families. Every time a waiter passed my table, their eyes would dart away uncomfortable with the sight of a young woman sitting entirely alone at a massive banquet table. The head waiter approached me 3 separate times, his voice dropping an octave in sheer pity as he asked if I wanted to order appetizers while I waited. I declined, each time my stomach twisting into tighter and tighter knots. The ice in my water glass had completely melted. Then my phone rang. The screen flashed with a picture of my mother, Valerie. I answered immediately, relief flooding my chest, expecting frantic apologies about gridlock on Interstate 85. But there was no apology. There was only the sound of chaotic background noise and my mother's exasperated, heavy sigh. "Zuri, listen to me," she said, her tone sharp and hurried. "We are not going to make it tonight. You need to cancel the table." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath straight from my lungs. I asked her what she meant, my voice trembling. I reminded her that the restaurant required a credit card on file for large parties, and the cancellation fee was $50 per head. My mother clicked her tongue in severe annoyance, as if I were a child complaining about a dropped ice cream cone. "Jasmine is having a massive crisis right now, and you need to stop being so selfish and think about your sister." Jasmine, my 33-year-old sister, was exactly 2 years older than me, yet she commanded our household like a spoiled toddler. I gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, my knuckles turning white against the polished wood. I asked what kind of life-altering crisis could possibly pull my entire family away from my birthday dinner. My mother spoke in a hushed, dramatic whisper, as if she were relaying a national tragedy of epic proportions. Liam got a flat tire on his way to a fraternity alumni event. Jasmine was riding with him, and now she is stranded on the side of the highway having a severe panic attack. We have to go rescue them immediately. Liam was Jasmine's new boyfriend. He was a white guy from a supposedly old money family, and my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on. They loved the idea of associating with his family name, eager to secure their own social status by proximity to his presumed wealth. I sat in the steakhouse surrounded by the smell of expensive roasted garlic and seared meat, trying to process the absolute absurdity of her statement. My 23rd birthday dinner, planned for over 2 months, was being completely abandoned because a grown man did not know how to change a tire and my adult sister was crying on the shoulder of the highway. I tried to reason with her. I kept my voice incredibly low, begging her to understand the humiliating situation I was in. I told her I was sitting at a table for 10 in a packed restaurant. I told her the waitstaff was staring at me and whispering. I asked if they could just send roadside assistance for Liam and come to the dinner like we planned. The line went silent for a split second before the phone was violently snatched away. Suddenly, the deep, booming, authoritarian voice of my father, Andre, filled my ear. "Zuri, do not start with your dramatic nonsense tonight," he commanded. The heavy authority in his voice was designed to make me feel tiny, to shrink me back into the obedient, invisible daughter I had always been. "Your sister is hyperventilating on the side of a dangerous dark road, and you are crying over a steak dinner. You need to grow up and realize the world does not revolve around you." I felt a hot, stinging tear slide down my cheek, ruining the makeup I had spent an entire hour perfecting. I reminded him that I had put my own debit card down to hold this reservation, because they had explicitly told me to handle all the logistics. I reminded him that the cancellation fee was $500, which was almost everything I had in my checking account at the time. I was barely making rent on my small apartment while they lived in a sprawling luxury mansion in the suburbs. I pleaded with him, explaining that if I paid this fee, I would not be able to afford groceries for the rest of the month. My father did not care. "You are an adult," he said coldly, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. "Handle your own financial obligations. We are not paying a cancellation fee because you foolishly booked a table that was far too large. Just pay the bill and take a public bus home. We need both cars tonight to handle this emergency with Liam's vehicle. Do not call us back. We have to focus on Jasmine right now." The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a steady, mocking laugh. Take a bus home. He wanted a young woman in an expensive evening gown to stand at a bus stop in the rain late at night because he was too busy catering to the manufactured panic of his golden child. My chest heaved as I stared at the blank screen of my phone. I was entirely alone. The realization was not just sad, it was violently clarifying. The dense fog of familial obligation began to burn away, leaving behind a sharp, stinging truth. I signaled the waiter. He approached tentatively, his eyes full of that unbearable pity I had been avoiding all night. I told him my party would not be arriving. I asked for the check for the cancellation fee. He looked at me, a young woman in a beautiful emerald dress sitting at a massive empty table, and I saw his jaw tighten with genuine, profound sympathy. He nodded without saying a word and walked away to fetch the bill. While I waited, the memories I had suppressed for years began to play in my mind like a highlight reel of disrespect. This was not a one-time mistake. This was the foundation of my entire existence in this family. I remembered my high school graduation. I had been named salutatorian. Minutes before I was supposed to walk across the stage and deliver my speech, Jasmine claimed she felt faint from the summer heat. She demanded my parents take her to the emergency room immediately. They missed my entire ceremony for what turned out to be mild dehydration. They never even apologized for missing the biggest moment of my young life. I remembered the day I was supposed to move into my college dorm. I had packed all my boxes into the hallway, waiting for my father to bring the rental van he promised. Instead, Jasmine decided she suddenly needed the van to move a vintage sofa she had bought for her sorority house. My parents told me to take a taxi to campus with whatever I could carry and leave the rest of my belongings behind. I had arrived at my dorm with 2 suitcases, while other girls had their parents helping them unpack hanging pictures and setting up their rooms with love. The waiter returned and placed the black leather folder gently on the table. The bill was exactly $500. I pulled out my debit card. It was a flimsy piece of plastic that represented weeks of aggressive saving and skipped meals. I handed it over, knowing that once this charge cleared, I would have exactly $14 left to my name. I would be eating rice and beans for the next 2 weeks. But as I signed the receipt, I did not feel poor. I felt like I was buying my freedom. This was the final invoice for my role as the family scapegoat. I was paying off my emotional debt, and the transaction was officially complete. I stood up, smoothed down the fabric of my green dress, and walked out of the steakhouse with my head held high. I did not look back at the empty table or the folded napkins. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the Atlanta pavement. The storm that had been brewing all evening finally broke. The rain came down in heavy freezing sheets, soaking through my silk dress within seconds. I walked toward the bus stop, my heels clicking against the wet concrete with purpose. The freezing rain washed away the makeup I had so carefully applied. It washed away the desperate, agonizing need for my parents' approval. It washed away the illusion that if I was just good enough or smart enough or accommodating enough, they would eventually love me the way they loved Jasmine. As I stood under the meager shelter of the bus stop, watching the headlights of passing cars blur in the downpour, a profound sense of absolute peace settled over my soul. I was 23 years old, shivering in the rain with $14 to my name, and I had never felt more incredibly powerful. They had left me for her again. But this time, I was leaving for good. The cold, clinical reality of owning my abuser's financial future became my quietest victory. I went about my life expanding Apex holdings and surrounding myself with a chosen family of fiercely loyal friends and colleagues who respected my mind and protected my peace. I never once looked back at Atlanta. I never searched for my parents on social media or checked to see if Jasmine had finally married her fake billionaire. I was completely content letting them exist in my past while I dominated my future. But toxic people have a profound inability to leave well enough alone. They thrive on having someone to look down upon, and without me there to play the role of the struggling failure, their perfect family dynamic must have felt hollow. 7 years almost to the day after I left my house key on that marble island, my executive assistant forwarded a message to my private inbox. She knew I maintained strict filters, but this particular email had bypassed the corporate firewall because it was sent to an incredibly old forwarding address I had set up during my college years. The subject line read, "Formal Wedding Invitation." I opened the email, and the sheer audacity of the words immediately transported me back to the suffocating environment I had escaped. The message was from Jasmine. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for reconciliation. It was a digital summons dripping with her signature brand of passive-aggressive superiority. Zuri, the email began omitting any standard greeting. Liam and I are finally tying the knot in what will undoubtedly be the social event of the season. Mom and Dad insisted we extend an invitation to you despite your dramatic departure. We assume you are still struggling to find your footing out there, but we are willing to let you witness this milestone. We are getting married at the most exclusive botanical estate in the region. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair, letting out a soft laugh. The estate she named the ultra-exclusive venue where she planned to flaunt her non-existent wealth was one of the crown jewels in my real estate portfolio. I had purchased that exact botanical estate under Apex Holdings 8 months prior, completely renovating its lush gardens and grand ballrooms. I was literally her landlord. But the email did not end there. Jasmine had a specific hidden agenda for reaching out after 7 years of absolute silence. She continued her message with a demand disguised as a request. "Since you will be attending, you need to bring Grandma's vintage diamond necklace. I know she specifically willed it to you before she passed, but it perfectly matches my bridal aesthetic. And Liam agrees that a piece of jewelry that valuable should be worn by a woman who can actually appreciate high society elegance. Do not forget to pack it." Before I could even process the sheer entitlement of her demanding the only heirloom I possessed, a second email pinged into my inbox. This one was from my mother, Valerie. She had been copied on Jasmine's message and decided to add her own toxic stipulations, assuming I was destitute and desperate for a free meal. Zuri, my mother wrote, I hope you have grown up since you abandoned your family. Since we are being gracious enough to allow you back into our circle for the weekend, there are rules. You may attend the rehearsal dinner, but you will need to earn your keep. We cannot have you mingling with Liam's distinguished family and embarrassing us with whatever low-level job you are working now. You will stand by the coat check room and assist the venue staff. Keep your head down, do not speak to Liam's parents, and try to look presentable. Bring the necklace. I sat in my penthouse office overlooking the sprawling city skyline, reading the emails again. They truly believed I was a broken, struggling woman, desperate to crawl back into their good graces. They wanted to use me as unpaid labor, hide me away like a shameful secret, and strip me of my only connection to my grandmother just to elevate their own fake prestige. I did not feel angry. Anger requires a level of emotional investment I no longer possessed for these people. Instead, I felt a deep, calculating amusement. The trap they were setting for me was actually a snare they were walking directly into. They had no idea they were demanding a billionaire CEO to work a coat check in her own luxury venue. They had no idea the old money family they were trying so desperately to impress was entirely owned by my holding company. I clicked reply to all. I typed out a single sentence matching their cold, formal energy. I will be there. I began preparing my disguise. I was going to walk straight into the lion's den, playing the exact role of the struggling, subservient sister they expected me to be. I instructed my executive assistant to rent a modest, mid-sized sedan. I went to a local department store and purchased a plain, inexpensive gray dress that looked appropriate but entirely unremarkable. I carefully packed my grandmother's vintage diamond necklace, locking it safely in a velvet box. I also prepared a separate, secure briefcase. Inside the briefcase were copies of the deed to the botanical estate, the finalized debt acquisition papers, proving Apex Holdings owned Liam's family assets, and a formal notice of immediate loan recall. I handed the briefcase to my head of private security, a towering, no-nonsense man named Marcus, who had been with me since my early days in venture capital. I told him to arrive at the venue separately and wait for my signal. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived carrying the heavy, humid warmth typical of the southern summer. I pulled my rented sedan up to the grand wrought iron gates of the botanical estate. The security guard, a man whose paycheck I authorized, checked my name off the guest list without recognizing me. I parked near the back of the lot and walked toward the grand conservatory where the event was being held. The venue looked spectacular. Thousands of fairy lights were strung through the massive glass atrium, illuminating exotic orchids and towering palms. The string quartet played softly in the corner, and elegantly dressed guests mingled with crystal champagne flutes. I walked through the grand mahogany doors, wearing my simple gray dress, and my grandmother's sparkling diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. I had not taken 5 steps into the foyer before Andre and Valerie intercepted me. My parents looked exactly the same, just slightly older, and infinitely more pretentious. My mother wore an overly elaborate sequined gown that screamed newly rich, while my father stood stiffly in a tailored tuxedo. They did not hug me. They did not ask how I had been for the last 7 years. Valerie immediately looked me up and down, her face contorting with visible disgust as she took in my plain dress. "Look at you," she hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me roughly toward a secluded alcove near the restrooms. "You show up to a high society event looking like a substitute teacher. I told you to look presentable, Zuri. This is exactly why we cannot let Liam's parents see you. You are a walking embarrassment." My father glared at me, crossing his arms over his chest. "I see the real world has not been kind to you," he sneered. "You thought you could run away and become somebody, but look at you now. Still a dropout? Still a failure showing up for a free meal. Now get to the coat room before anyone important sees you." I maintained a perfectly blank expression, absorbing their insults without a flinch. I nodded submissively, playing my part to perfection. I walked toward the coat room area, standing quietly near the edge of the grand ballroom, observing the crowd. It did not take long for Liam to spot me. He sauntered over, holding a glass of expensive bourbon dripping in unearned, arrogant privilege. He wore a custom suit and a smug smile, acting as if he owned the very building we were standing in. "Well, well, well, the prodigal sister returns," Liam mocked, looking me up and down. "Jasmine told me you were struggling, but this is just sad." He took a sip of his bourbon, shaking his head. "You should be taking notes, Zuri. I am dropping $150,000 on this wedding weekend alone. But that is what happens when you marry a real man with real money. Jasmine finally has someone to elevate her out of your family's mediocrity." I looked at Liam, suppressing the urge to laugh. I knew for a fact that the credit card he used to pay the venue deposit had bounced twice before barely clearing on a predatory high-interest line of credit. I knew his parents' estate was heavily mortgaged and facing foreclosure. Yet here he was boasting about wealth that did not exist, trying to make me feel small. "I am sure Jasmine is very impressed with your finances," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Liam smirked, clearly mistaking my calm demeanor for submission. "Just stay out of the way tonight," he ordered. "My parents have a reputation to uphold, and we do not need the charity case ruining the photos." He walked away just as Jasmine approached, flanked by 3 bridesmaids who looked like clones of her. Jasmine wore a white silk rehearsal gown that probably cost more than my parents' mortgage. She stopped in front of me, her eyes immediately locking onto my neck. "I see you brought the necklace," Jasmine said, holding out her hand expectantly. "Take it off, Zuri. It is time to hand it over to someone who actually belongs in this tax bracket. A charity case has no business wearing diamonds." Her bridesmaids giggled, whispering behind their hands. Jasmine reached out, attempting to physically unhook the delicate gold clasp of our grandmother's necklace right off my neck. I took a sharp step back, slapping her hand away. My expression turned to ice. The time for playing the victim was over. The submissive, struggling sister act vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating presence of a CEO who was about to dismantle their entire reality. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye and smiled a slow, terrifying smile. "I will not be taking the necklace off," I said quietly. "But I think it is time for the dinner toasts." I turned my back on my stunned sister and walked purposefully toward the center of the grand ballroom, where a microphone stood on a small elevated stage. The room buzzed with polite conversation as I climbed the 2 steps and tapped the microphone. The sharp feedback noise echoed through the glass conservatory, immediately silencing the crowd. Valerie and Andre rushed forward, their faces pale with panic, frantically gesturing for me to step down. Liam looked furious, clearly thinking the embarrassing sister was about to make a drunken fool of herself. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with absolute steady authority. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Zuri. I am Jasmine's older sister. But more importantly, for the context of tonight's gathering, I am the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Liam's parents, who had been standing near the bar, suddenly froze, turning to stare at me with wide, terrified eyes. They recognized the name of the holding company that owned their entire financial existence. My parents looked bewildered, completely failing to understand what was happening. Jasmine marched toward the stage, her face red with fury. "Stop making up lies and get off the stage, you psycho!" she shrieked. I ignored her and signaled the venue's audio-visual team. I had briefed them entirely beforehand. The massive media screens positioned around the ballroom suddenly flickered to life. The first document projected onto the bright LED screens was the official property deed for the botanical estate we were currently standing in. "I know Jasmine and Liam have been boasting about the incredible expense of this venue," I continued, my voice echoing across the silent room. "But as the legal owner of this estate, I feel it is my duty to inform you that I am officially canceling their booking for tomorrow's wedding ceremony, effective immediately due to a severe breach of conduct and outstanding debts." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Valerie let out a strangled cry, clutching my father's arm. Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the screen in absolute horror as she saw my name legally printed as the primary owner of the estate. "But I am not finished," I said, keeping my posture completely relaxed. I pressed a button on a small remote in my hand, and the screens transitioned to the second set of documents. These were the finalized debt acquisition papers, clearly detailing the catastrophic financial ruin of Liam's family. Liam has spent the evening bragging about dropping $150,000 on this wedding, I announced, looking directly at the groom, whose face had drained of all color. What he failed to mention is that his family is entirely bankrupt. They are surviving on fraudulent credit lines and predatory loans. Apex Holdings recently acquired all of their outstanding debt. That $150,000 was put on a fraudulent credit line, and as the primary creditor, I am officially calling in the loan right now. Sheer unprecedented chaos erupted in the ballroom. Liam's parents did not even attempt to argue. The shame was too absolute. They turned and practically sprinted toward the exit, fleeing the venue to escape the burning stares of their high society peers. Liam stood frozen, his mouth hanging open, his illusion of superiority completely shattered into dust. Jasmine shrieked in horror, clutching her head as she realized the billionaire lifestyle she had manipulated our parents to secure was entirely fake. She was marrying a broke man who owed his very existence to the sister she had just tried to strip of a necklace. Andre and Valerie scrambled toward the stage, completely humiliated in front of the Atlanta elite they worshipped. Their desperation was palpable as they tried to completely rewrite history in front of everyone. Zuri, my father, pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "We are so proud of you. We always knew you were our successful daughter. Please let us handle this as a family." I looked down at them, feeling absolutely nothing but pity. "We are not a family," I said, my voice ringing with finality through the microphone. "You cut me off. You threw me away. And tonight you tried to hide me in a coat room. You do not get to claim my success when you contributed nothing but trauma." I signaled to Marcus, my head of security, who stepped out from the shadows flanked by 4 other massive security guards. "Please escort these individuals off my property," I instructed, pointing to my parents, my sister, and her fraudulent groom. The guests watched in stunned silence as my security team expertly and firmly guided my screaming sister, my humiliated parents, and a defeated Liam out the grand mahogany doors and into the humid Atlanta night. The wedding was over before it even began. The fallout was swift and absolute. The wedding was permanently canceled. Jasmine and Liam's toxic relationship imploded the very next morning when the reality of his massive debt set in. Andre and Valerie became social pariahs in Atlanta, their country club reputation entirely destroyed by the scandal of their cruelty and their association with Liam's fraudulent wealth. I reflect on my life now at 35 years old. I am standing on the expansive balcony of my own penthouse, breathing in the cool night air. I am wearing my grandmother's diamond necklace, and inside my home, I am surrounded by a chosen family of friends and colleagues who love and respect me unconditionally. The empire I built from $14 remains untouchable. Family is not always blood. Sometimes it is the people who do not leave you stranded with the bill. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of taking back your power. The bus ride back to my parents' house took 45 minutes. I sat shivering in the back row with my ruined silk dress clinging to my skin. Every jolt of the bus felt like a physical reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I arrived at the gated community, walking past the manicured lawns and towering oak trees that shielded our neighborhood from the real world. My parents' sprawling brick mansion sat in absolute silence. The driveway was completely empty. They were still out playing the role of heroic rescuers for Jasmine and Liam. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The house smelled of expensive vanilla diffusers and lemon polish. It was a fortress of perfection where human emotions were treated as inconvenient stains on a pristine rug. I walked straight upstairs to my bedroom. The walls were painted a soft, neutral beige, specifically chosen by my mother because it fit the aesthetic of a model home. I did not waste time crying or looking at old photographs. My movements were sharp and methodical, driven by a cold, burning energy. I pulled my worn duffel bag from the back of the closet. I made a very specific rule for myself as I opened my dresser drawers. I would only take what I had purchased with my own money. Everything else stayed behind. Every designer sweater my mother bought to make me look presentable at her country club events was left on the hangers. Every piece of jewelry my father gifted me after a particularly bad argument, as a silent apology, was left in its velvet box. I packed my basic shirts, my comfortable jeans, the laptop I bought refurbished from a campus surplus store, and my portfolio of business ideas. Within 20 minutes, my entire existence in that house was reduced to a single duffel bag and a backpack. I walked downstairs feeling the silence of the empty mansion pressing against my ears. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen. The countertops were made of gleaming white marble, untouched and pristine. I reached into my purse and pulled out my heavy brass house key. I placed it perfectly in the center of the kitchen island. It sat there cold and final, acting as a definitive resignation from my role as the family scapegoat. I did not write a dramatic letter. I did not leave an emotional note demanding an apology they were incapable of giving. The empty space I was leaving behind was the only message they needed. I walked out the front door, pulling it firmly shut behind me until I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place. I caught a late-night train to downtown Atlanta and sat in the brightly lit waiting room of the Greyhound bus terminal. My clothes were finally drying, but the chill remained in my bones. It was almost 3 in the morning when my phone screen suddenly lit up. The quiet hum of the bus station was shattered by a rapid succession of notifications. My parents had finally returned home. I watched the messages pour in, forming a steady stream of toxic vitriol that only confirmed I was making the right decision. The first text was from my mother, Valerie. She wrote asking why my key was on the kitchen island. She said Liam came inside to use the restroom and saw it sitting there looking like trash. She told me I was completely embarrassing them and demanded to know where I was. There was zero concern for my safety. She did not ask if I made it home in the rain. She did not ask if I was okay. She was furious because my house key had disrupted the visual perfection of her kitchen counter while a white man from a supposedly wealthy family was in her home. 10 seconds later, a text from my father, Andre, arrived. His message was even more vicious. He told me that if this was another one of my dramatic tantrums, I could forget about coming back. He said they were sick and tired of my selfish behavior. He accused me of ruining Jasmine's evening by acting sullen on the phone and claimed I was now pulling a stunt. He called me a complete failure. He proudly announced they were cutting off my phone plan and my emergency credit card immediately. He told me not to expect them to bail me out when I realized how hard the real world actually was. He ended the message by stating I would come crawling back to them by the end of the week. I sat in the plastic terminal chair reading their words over and over. They truly believed I was weak. They believed their financial control and conditional love were the only things keeping me alive. They thought I would panic at the threat of being cut off and rush back to apologize for the inconvenience of my own boundaries. I felt a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. I opened my phone settings and navigated to the factory reset option. I did not type out a furious reply. I did not try to defend my character to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I simply erased everything. I wiped the phone completely clean, removing my digital footprint from their family plan. I took the memory card out and dropped the device into a nearby trash can. I walked up to the ticketing counter and used my last $14 to buy a one-way ticket on the first bus heading north to Charlotte. I had no solid plan, no savings, and no safety net. But as I boarded that bus and found a window seat in the back, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of power. The heavy, suffocating chains of the golden child and the scapegoat dynamic were finally broken. As the bus pulled out of the station, leaving the glittering skyline of Atlanta behind me in the dark, I closed my eyes and breathed in the stale, recycled air. It was the absolute sweetest breath I had ever taken. I was erasing myself from their world entirely, and I was never going back. The next few years became a blur of relentless, grueling hustle. I arrived in Charlotte with nothing but my duffel bag and a burning desire to build an undeniable future. I rented a tiny windowless room in a shared apartment and slept on a thin mattress on the floor. I worked 3 low-paying jobs to keep the lights on. I scrubbed floors at a corporate office building overnight, poured coffee at a busy cafe during the early morning rush, and spent my afternoons doing freelance data entry. I lived on cheap ramen and peanut butter skipping meals more often than I ate them. But without the crushing weight of my parents' conditional love dragging me down, my mind was sharper than ever. I was no longer wasting my energy trying to be seen or valued by people who were blind to my worth. All that energy channeled directly into my ambition. I realized very quickly that the commercial real estate market was operating on outdated, inefficient systems. I spent every spare hour sitting in public libraries using their free internet to teach myself coding and advanced financial modeling. I poured my soul into developing a proprietary software platform designed to identify undervalued commercial properties and streamline the acquisition process. I pitched my platform to smaller investment firms, first taking payment in equity rather than cash. My software worked beautifully. It allowed investors to close deals twice as fast as their competitors with incredible accuracy. Soon the platform exploded in value. I capitalized on that momentum and pivoted directly into venture capital, forming my own firm called Apex Holdings. By the time I turned 30, I was a self-made multimillionaire. I built an empire in absolute silence. I maintained strict anonymity, utilizing ironclad non-disclosure agreements and layers of corporate shell companies. I let my limited liability companies buy up luxury venues, commercial high-rises, and botanical estates across the South. I wore simple tailored suits and kept my natural hair in neat protective styles, moving through corporate boardrooms as a quiet, lethal force. No one in the Atlanta high society circles knew my name. I was a ghost who owned the very buildings they partied in. My life was peaceful and highly structured until one Tuesday morning when a routine corporate acquisition file crossed my heavy mahogany desk. My acquisitions team had flagged a portfolio of distressed assets belonging to a prominent old money family. I opened the thick manila folder and felt a sudden sharp jolt of recognition. The assets belonged to Liam's family. The very same Liam who had stranded his car on the highway the night of my 23rd birthday. The man my parents had practically worshipped for his supposed wealth and unearned status. I read through the financial forensic disclosures with cold, calculating precision. Liam's family was entirely broke. Their generational wealth was a complete illusion. Their businesses were hemorrhaging money, and they were surviving solely on fraudulent credit lines and predatory loans just to keep up appearances. They were drowning in massive debt, using their fading family name to secure extensions they could never actually repay. It was a pathetic, fragile house of cards, and it was completely vulnerable. I realized in that moment my parents had sold me out and treated me like garbage for a man who was financially poorer than I was when I was scrubbing office floors. In a strictly business-oriented, emotionless move, I directed Apex Holdings to buy out the entirety of Liam's family debt. We purchased their outstanding loans for pennies on the dollar and quietly acquired the liens on their family estate and their failing commercial businesses. I signed the acquisition papers with a steady hand. I now essentially owned their assets. I held the absolute keys to their financial survival. They remained blissfully unaware that the black sheep sister they had discarded was now their primary creditor and ultimate landlord. I sat completely still at the massive table as the dial tone buzzed against my ear. The heavy mahogany wood beneath my fingertips felt grounding, anchoring me to the present moment while my mind raced. The steakhouse bustled around me, filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of wealthy patrons enjoying their evening. I was an island of absolute isolation in a sea of celebration. The phone screen went black, reflecting my own tired face back at me. A wave of cold, clinical clarity washed over my entire body. It was not a sudden burst of hot rage or a frantic desire to beg for their attention. It was a freezing, paralyzing realization that this exact scenario was not an accident or a singular lapse in judgment. This was the exact blueprint of my entire life. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me, no longer fighting to suppress them. The pattern had always been there, glaring and obvious, but I had spent 23 years making excuses for the people who were supposed to love me. I remembered the humid morning of my high school graduation. I had worked tirelessly for 4 years, earning the title of salutatorian. I had written a speech that I practiced in front of my bedroom mirror for weeks. My parents had purchased front row tickets. But 45 minutes before I was scheduled to walk across the stage, Jasmine claimed she felt dangerously faint. She clutched her chest, gasping for air and insisting her heart was failing. My parents swept her away to the emergency room, leaving me standing alone in my cap and gown. I delivered my speech to a crowd of strangers scanning the front row for faces that were not there. The hospital discharged Jasmine 2 hours later with a diagnosis of mild dehydration. My parents never apologized. They simply told me I should be grateful my sister survived a medical scare. The memory shifted, blurring into the blistering August afternoon when I was supposed to leave for college. I had spent the entire summer working double shifts at a local diner to afford my dorm supplies. I had neatly packed everything into boxes, lining them up by the front door, waiting for my father to bring the rental van he had promised weeks in advance. Instead, Jasmine decided she absolutely needed that exact van to transport a vintage velvet sofa she had impulsively purchased for her sorority house. My mother handed me a wad of cash and told me to hail a cab to campus with whatever suitcases I could carry. I left half of my belongings sitting in the hallway. I arrived at my freshman dorm, hauling 2 heavy bags by myself, watching other girls embrace their weeping, proud parents. I had swallowed the humiliation then, just as I was expected to swallow it now. But sitting in this steakhouse on my 23rd birthday, the bitter taste of their conditional love finally became too toxic to endure. The waitstaff avoided my gaze entirely, their pity radiating across the room. I raised my hand and signaled the head waiter. He approached my table with hesitant, careful steps, his posture practically radiating sympathy. I looked up at him, keeping my voice completely steady and devoid of tears. "My party will not be arriving," I told him. "I need to pay the cancellation fee for the table." He nodded slowly, pulling a black leather folder from his apron. The restaurant policy was strict, requiring a $50 fee for every absent guest. $500. It was an exorbitant sum that represented a month of groceries and absolute financial security for a struggling 23-year-old. I unclasped my purse and pulled out my worn debit card. I knew exactly how much was in my checking account: $514. I placed the plastic card onto the leather tray, pushing it toward the waiter. I did not flinch. I did not explain my situation. I simply waited for the transaction to process. When he returned with the receipt, I signed my name with sharp, definitive strokes. The financial loss was devastating, but in that moment, it felt like a cheap price to pay for my permanent freedom. I was purchasing my own liberation from a family that viewed my existence as a burdensome afterthought. I left a cash tip with my remaining few dollars, gathered my coat, and stood up. I walked through the crowded dining room, keeping my chin parallel to the floor. I did not let a single tear fall. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the unforgiving Atlanta night. The sky had completely broken open, unleashing a torrential downpour that instantly soaked through my thin coat and my emerald green dress. The cold rain plastered my hair against my cheeks and chilled me to the bone. I began the long walk toward the nearest bus stop, putting one foot in front of the other as the storm raged around me. Every step away from that restaurant felt like a heavy chain snapping. The freezing water washed away the lingering, desperate hope that I could ever earn their love by being obedient. It washed away the guilt they had programmed into my psyche. I stood under the meager shelter of a rusted bus stop, shivering violently in the dark. As the headlights of the approaching bus cut through the rain, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself. I was completely, utterly done with them. The bus ride back to my parents' sprawling, image-obsessed suburban home was a quiet descent into my new reality. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon color. I arrived at the gated community and walked the remaining half-mile to their house, my wet shoes squishing loudly on the pristine pavement. The massive brick home loomed in the darkness, exuding a cold, intimidating aura. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was perfectly, completely empty. The silence was deafening. My parents were still out coddling Jasmine and catering to Liam's flat tire crisis. I did not hesitate. I walked straight up the sweeping staircase and into the bedroom I had occupied since childhood. I pulled my largest duffel bag from the closet and began to pack. I moved methodically, working in record time. I did not pack out of panic. I packed with the precision of a woman dismantling a life she no longer recognized. I took only the items I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. My comfortable jeans, my simple shirts, the refurbished laptop I used for my business ideas. I left every single designer item my mother had forced upon me to make me look acceptable at her country club luncheons. I left the expensive jewelry my father had given me as hollow apologies for his frequent emotional absences. I reduced 23 years of existence in that house to a single heavy duffel bag. I walked back downstairs, my bag slung over my shoulder. I stood in the center of the immaculate gourmet kitchen, staring at the gleaming white marble island. It was the centerpiece of my mother's manufactured domestic perfection. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass house key. The metal was warm from my body heat. I placed the key precisely in the dead center of the marble island. It sat there serving as a stark physical symbol of my resignation. It was the absolute severing of my ties to their bottomless toxicity. I did not leave a letter explaining my feelings. I did not leave a dramatic note demanding closure. I simply walked out the front door, locking it behind me for the very last time. I sought refuge in the harshly lit waiting room of the downtown Greyhound bus terminal. My clothes were still damp from the freezing rain, but the chill in my bones was completely eclipsed by a burning adrenaline. I found a secluded plastic chair in the corner of the station, placing my heavy duffel bag between my feet. The terminal smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, a sharp contrast to the expensive vanilla diffusers I had just left behind. I sat there watching the clock on the wall tick past midnight. I knew they would be arriving home soon. I knew the exact sequence of events that would follow. They would walk through the grand double doors, fawning over Jasmine and Liam. My mother would head straight to the kitchen island to pour them a glass of imported wine. And that is when she would see it. It happened almost exactly at 1 a.m. The cheap smartphone in my pocket began to vibrate with a sudden violent intensity. The buzzing was relentless, rattling against the plastic armrest of my chair. I pulled the device out and watched the screen illuminate the dark corner of the terminal. Notifications stacked up rapidly, overlapping one another in a chaotic cascade of digital fury. My parents had returned. They had found the key. I swiped open the screen, expecting perhaps a single fleeting message of parental panic. A small part of me wondered if they would ask where I was, or if I was safe in the storm. That foolish, lingering hope was instantly eradicated the second I read my mother's words. Valerie did not ask if I had been kidnapped or hurt. She was completely consumed by rage over aesthetics and social optics. Her first message was a massive block of frantic text. She demanded to know why my house key was sitting in the middle of her pristine marble island. She wrote that Liam had walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water and saw my key sitting there like a piece of abandoned trash. She told me I was a deeply vindictive person who was deliberately trying to humiliate the family in front of a man with respectable pedigree. "How dare you pull a stunt like this while we have important guests in our home?" she typed. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. You have always been jealous of your sister, and now you are throwing a childish tantrum because we had to prioritize a real emergency." I read the words twice, letting the sheer narcissism of her perspective wash over me. She was not losing a daughter. She was annoyed by a visual blemish in her kitchen while trying to impress a man she barely knew. Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of her priorities, a second wave of messages crashed into my inbox. These were from my father. Andre did not bother with passive-aggressive guilt trips. He went straight for the throat, wielding his financial power like a weapon. He commanded me to answer my phone immediately. When I did not comply, his messages grew increasingly venomous. He called me a pathetic failure. He said I had achieved absolutely nothing of value in my 23 years on Earth, and this dramatic exit was just another example of my profound weakness. He explicitly told me that my phone plan was being terminated by sunrise. He stated that he was freezing my emergency credit card and removing my name from the family auto insurance policy. "You are officially cut off," he declared in bold capitalization. "Let us see how long you survive in the real world without my money propping you up. You are soft and you are foolish. When you are starving by the end of the week, do not expect us to open the door. You will come crawling back on your hands and knees, begging for forgiveness. And when you do, you will apologize to Jasmine and Liam for ruining their evening." I sat in the bus terminal reading the messages as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. They truly believed I was nothing without them. They genuinely thought their financial control and their conditional approval were the only things keeping me tethered to the earth. They expected me to panic. They expected me to stare at my dwindling bank account and break down in tears, realizing I was unequipped to handle the harsh realities of independence. They anticipated a desperate, apologetic phone call before the sun even came up. But I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound invincibility. They had just handed me the greatest gift I could ever receive. They had completely absolved me of any remaining guilt. By reacting to my departure with pure venom and arrogant cruelty, they proved that my absence was not a tragedy to them. It was merely an inconvenience. I did not type out a furious reply defending my character. I did not waste my breath trying to explain my pain to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I simply opened the settings application on my phone. I navigated to the system menu and selected the factory reset option. I watched the screen go entirely black as the device wiped every single contact, every photograph, every saved message, and every digital tie to the family I was abandoning. When the phone rebooted to its factory default screen, I popped open the side tray and pulled out the small plastic SIM card. I held it between my fingers for a split second before snapping it completely in half. I dropped the broken pieces into the bottom of a nearby trash can alongside half-eaten sandwiches and discarded newspapers. I was no longer a contact in their phones. I was no longer a problem they needed to manage. I was a ghost. I picked up my duffel bag and walked straight to the ticketing counter. The attendant looked at me with tired eyes, resting his hand over the keyboard. I pulled out my remaining cash and asked for the next available bus heading to Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a city where I knew absolutely no one. A city where my parents' names held zero weight and commanded zero respect. A city where I could build a foundation on concrete rather than walking on eggshells. The attendant handed me a paper ticket and pointed toward Gate 4. I walked out to the boarding area as the massive silver bus pulled into the stall. The engine idled loudly, drowning out the sound of the lingering rain. I handed my ticket to the driver, stepped onto the bus, and walked all the way to the back row. I took a window seat, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. As the bus shifted into gear and pulled out of the terminal, I watched the glittering skyline of Atlanta slowly fade into the darkness. I was leaving behind 23 years of psychological conditioning. I was leaving behind the golden child who demanded my subservience and the parents who enabled my erasure. I had no safety net, no credit cards, and no wealthy connections to fall back on. But as the highway stretched out in front of me, illuminated only by the headlights of the bus, I felt a deep, powerful calm settle into my chest. They told me I would fail. They promised I would come crawling back to them begging for their toxic shelter. I closed my eyes and let the steady rumble of the highway carry me forward. I was completely alone in the world, and I had never been more dangerous. The bus pulled into the terminal in Charlotte just as the morning sun began to bleed over the horizon. I stepped onto the concrete and inhaled deeply. The air tasted completely different. I had a duffel bag, a backpack, and $14. I walked straight to a 24-hour diner, locked myself in the restroom to wash my face, and used my last few bills to buy a black coffee so I could sit in a booth and read the local classifieds. I did not have the luxury of fear. Fear was an emotion reserved strictly for people who had a safety net waiting to catch them. I only had survival. Within 48 hours, I secured a room in a dilapidated boarding house on the industrial edge of the city. It was a windowless box barely larger than a walk-in closet, but the heavy wooden door had a sturdy deadbolt. I found a discarded twin mattress leaning against a dumpster, dragged it up 3 flights of stairs, and covered it with a cheap fitted sheet. That stained mattress on the floor became my throne. I slept infinitely better on those broken metal springs than I ever did in my custom-built canopy bed in my parents' mansion. The physical reality of my new existence was grueling. I engineered a daily schedule that left absolutely zero room for self-pity or hesitation. At 5 in the morning, I tied on a brown apron and poured coffee at a busy diner catering to the early shift construction workers. I learned to balance heavy trays of eggs and hash browns, ignoring the persistent aching in my lower back. By 1 in the afternoon, I stripped off the apron and walked 2 miles to a temp agency, where I sat in a gray cubicle doing mindless data entry until the sun went down. But the real work began when the city went to sleep. At 10 o'clock at night, I put on a pair of rubber gloves and pushed a heavy mop bucket through the silent, carpeted corridors of a commercial real estate firm. I scrubbed their polished marble lobbies, emptied their overflowing trash cans, and wiped down their massive executive desks. I was a ghost moving through the very boardrooms I intended to conquer. My body was constantly bruised and pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. My diet consisted entirely of boiled ramen noodles, cheap peanut butter, and tap water. I lost 15 pounds in the first 3 months alone. My hands grew calloused and my nails were permanently chipped. Yet despite the brutal physical toll, my mind had never been sharper. For 23 years, my brain had been completely occupied with survival tactics in a toxic household. My mental energy had been entirely drained by the constant exhausting need to anticipate my mother's shifting moods, to dodge my father's financial manipulation, and to brace myself for Jasmine's inevitable manufactured crises. I had spent my entire life walking on eggshells, analyzing every word I spoke to avoid triggering an explosive argument. Now the eggshells were gone. The suffocating weight of their conditional love evaporated, leaving behind a vast, quiet space in my mind. In the silence of my windowless room, I could finally hear my own thoughts. There were no comparisons to Jasmine. Nobody was telling me I was too plain, too serious, or too much of a disappointment. The absence of their voices allowed my own inner voice to surface, and it was deafeningly clear. As I scrubbed those corporate floors late at night, I did not feel degraded. I felt intensely observant. I started looking at the documents left out on those massive mahogany desks. I read the commercial real estate portfolios, the acquisition reports, the investment strategies. I absorbed the language of capital and leverage. I realized the executives who sat in these chairs during the day were not inherently smarter than I was. They simply had access to resources and a head start. I had something far more potent. I had absolutely nothing to lose. My ambition, unchained from familial expectations, woke up like a starving animal. Every floor I mopped, every database I updated, every cup of coffee I poured, fueled a singular burning objective. I was not just surviving to pay rent. I was financing my own education. I started taking my meager tips and buying used textbooks on coding, corporate finance, and real estate law. I carried them in my backpack, reading them on the city bus, reading them during my 15-minute diner breaks, reading them until my eyes burned under the single bare light bulb in my tiny room. The first 2 years of my independence were a crucible of isolation and intense hyper-focus. I did not date. I did not make friends. I did not go to parties or movies or restaurants. I became a machine powered by raw, unwavering determination. The memory of my father telling me I would fail, and the image of my mother commanding me to take the bus in the rain, became the exact coal I shoveled into the furnace of my drive. I was building a foundation on solid concrete, carefully constructing an intellect and a work ethic that no one could ever take away from me. The scared girl from Atlanta was dead. In her place, a quiet, relentless force was taking root, preparing to tear the world apart and rebuild it in my image. The knowledge I extracted from those discarded corporate documents became the foundation of my absolute dominance. I spent the next 18 months sitting on my mattress in the dark, using my refurbished laptop to write line after line of complex code. I realized that the commercial real estate market in the South was incredibly lucrative, but operated on sluggish, outdated, and highly emotional systems. The executives whose floors I mopped relied on nepotism, country club handshakes, and golf course rumors to find their next acquisitions. I designed a proprietary software platform that completely eliminated the need for any of that. My algorithm scraped municipal databases, court filings, foreclosure notices, and zoning board agendas in real time. It cross-referenced distressed commercial properties with upcoming municipal infrastructure projects, identifying massive financial opportunities months before the traditional investors even knew a property was in trouble. I stripped away the human error and replaced it with cold, undeniable data. I took a day off from the diner, put on the only professional suit I owned, and walked into the lobby of a mid-tier investment firm that was desperately trying to compete with the major players in Charlotte. I did not ask for a job. I asked for a meeting with their managing partner, and I refused to leave the waiting room until he gave me 10 minutes of his time. When I finally sat across from him, I opened my laptop and showed him how my software had predicted their last 3 failed acquisitions and how it could have saved them millions. I did not sell them the software outright. I licensed it to them, retaining total ownership and demanding a ruthless percentage of every deal closed using my platform. They agreed because they had no other choice if they wanted to survive in the market. The software deployed, and it immediately revolutionized their entire operation. They began closing deals with terrifying speed and precision, decimating their local competition. Within 6 months, word of my platform spread through the financial sector like wildfire. Major firms approached me begging for access to the algorithm. I licensed the tech to 5 major investment banks across the eastern seaboard. The revenue did not just trickle in, it flooded my bank accounts in massive, overwhelming waves. I watched my net worth skyrocket from the $14 I had in Atlanta to 7 figures in a matter of months. But I was not satisfied with just being a software vendor. Providing the tools for other people to build their wealth was merely a stepping stone. I wanted to own the board. I took the massive capital generated by the software boom and executed a sharp strategic pivot. I cashed out a significant portion of my tech equity and established my own venture capital and private equity firm. I named it Apex Holdings. The name was a private promise to myself. I was no longer the girl at the bottom of the family hierarchy begging for scraps of affection. I was the apex predator in a financial ecosystem that rewarded absolute ruthlessness. By the time I turned 30, I was a self-made multimillionaire. My personal wealth completely eclipsed the generational money my parents so desperately flaunted. But unlike my mother and father, I had absolutely no desire to showcase my success. I grew up watching them destroy their peace and alienate their children just to maintain the illusion of high society perfection. They craved the spotlight. They needed the validation of country club peers and the envy of their neighbors to feel like their lives had meaning. I chose the exact opposite path. I weaponized my anonymity. I operated Apex Holdings from behind an ironclad fortress of non-disclosure agreements, blind trusts, and proxy board members. My name never appeared on a single piece of public-facing company literature. I hired an elite team of aggressive attorneys and financial managers to act as the public face of the firm, while I pulled every single string from the shadows. To the outside world, the CEO of Apex Holdings was simply an unnamed managing partner. I became a ghost in the financial sector, moving massive amounts of capital without ever stepping foot on a red carpet or attending a charity gala. With my anonymity secured, I directed my acquisitions team to aggressively buy up premium commercial real estate across the South. We did not just buy office buildings, we targeted the exact spaces where high society congregated. Apex Holdings purchased luxury botanical estates, high-end golf resorts, exclusive wedding venues, and premium retail blocks in Charlotte, Charleston, and eventually Atlanta. I bought the physical ground that the elite class walked on. I lived in a sprawling, modern penthouse overlooking the city, but my daily life remained highly disciplined and deeply private. I did not buy flashy sports cars or designer clothing covered in glaring logos. I wore custom-tailored suits in muted colors and poured my energy into expanding my empire. I was perfectly content being completely invisible. Every time my firm acquired a new luxury estate or bought out a struggling commercial high-rise, I felt the quiet, satisfying hum of absolute control. I had constructed a reality where I answered to absolutely no one. My empire operated with mechanical precision. Every Tuesday morning at 6, I sat at the custom marble desk in my penthouse office, reviewing the distressed asset portfolios my acquisitions team flagged for potential purchase. It was a rainy October morning, perfectly mirroring the day I left Atlanta. My chief financial analyst had placed a heavy red folder on the top of my priority stack. The attached briefing note simply read, "High-value Southern portfolio, severe default risk." I opened the file and began scanning the executive summary. The assets belonged to a prominent family trust based in Georgia. I turned the page to look at the primary guarantors, and the blood instantly froze in my veins. There, printed in crisp black ink, was the legal name of Liam's family. It was the exact same Liam who had stranded his car on the shoulder of the highway the night of my 23rd birthday. The man my parents had practically worshipped, treating his very presence in our home like a visit from royalty. My mother and father had sacrificed my dignity, my birthday, and my place in the family simply to appease him. They had looked at his pale skin and his supposedly historic family name and assumed he held the keys to the elite society they so desperately craved. I leaned forward in my leather chair, pressing my fingers to my temples. I buzzed my acquisitions director and ordered a complete forensic financial audit on the entire family trust. I wanted every bank statement, every tax return, every outstanding line of credit, and every property deed pulled and verified by noon. I sat in absolute silence, waiting for the data to compile. When the encrypted files finally dropped into my inbox, I spent 3 hours dissecting their entire financial existence. The truth was staggering. Liam's highly revered old money family was completely, absolutely broke. Their generational wealth was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated optical illusion. The grand historical estate they used to host their lavish parties was leveraged to the absolute limit, carrying 3 separate mortgages that were currently 90 days past due. Their traditional commercial businesses were bleeding capital, operating at a massive loss for the last 6 years. To maintain their country club memberships, their luxury vehicles, and their private social club status, they had been engaging in borderline illegal financial gymnastics. I dug deeper into the spreadsheets, uncovering a web of fraudulent corporate credit lines. They were creating dummy corporations to take out high-interest business loans, then funneling that cash directly into their personal accounts to cover their lifestyle expenses. They were drowning under the weight of predatory lending, moving money from one failing account to another just to make the minimum monthly payments. They were months away from total catastrophic financial collapse. The entire family name was a hollow shell waiting for a single gust of wind to knock it completely down. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my throat, echoing in the quiet expanse of my penthouse office. The sheer, undeniable irony of the situation was almost poetic. My parents had treated me like a pathetic charity case. They had called me a failure and cut off my emergency credit card to punish me for not bowing down to this man. They had discarded their own flesh and blood to align themselves with a family they believed was superior in every conceivable way. Yet the financial data staring back at me proved that Liam was mathematically poorer than I had been when I was scrubbing toilets and sleeping on a floor mattress. His net worth was severely negative. I possessed more liquid capital in my secondary checking account than his entire bloodline had generated in the last decade. My parents had sold me out for a man who could not even afford the tires on the car he drove. I did not feel a sudden rush of hot emotional rage. I did not immediately think about calling my parents to rub this information in their faces. My mind remained locked in the clinical, calculating framework of a venture capitalist. I looked at Liam's family not as ghosts from my traumatic past, but as highly vulnerable, distressed assets. Their historic estate sat on 50 acres of prime developable land in a rapidly appreciating district. The underlying value of the physical property was immense if the toxic debt could be cleared. The current creditors were panicked, holding high-risk loans they assumed would default into a messy, prolonged bankruptcy. They would be desperate to offload that debt to a firm like Apex Holdings for a fraction of the cost, just to wipe it off their ledgers. Liam's family was living on borrowed time, relying on the ignorance of their peers to keep their social standing intact. I closed the financial audit and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. The golden child sister who tormented me was likely planning her future around a man whose pockets were entirely empty. The parents who threw me away were hitching their wagon to a sinking ship. They were all living in a fabricated reality built on lies and stolen money. And I was the only person holding the sledgehammer. I picked up the secure phone on my desk and dialed my director of acquisitions. I did not raise my voice or express a single ounce of personal vendetta. I gave a very simple clinical directive. I told him to acquire the entire debt portfolio of Liam's family trust. I wanted every mortgage, every commercial business loan, and every high-interest line of credit brought under the Apex Holdings umbrella by the end of the fiscal quarter. My team moved with the lethal efficiency I demanded of them. They approached the panicked regional banks and private lenders who were currently holding the toxic assets. Those institutions were absolutely desperate to scrub the failing accounts from their ledgers before the end of the year. We offered them a fraction of the total value in cold hard cash. They accepted the buyout without a single moment of hesitation. The transaction was executed through 3 separate shell companies nested securely beneath the Apex corporate structure. The legal paperwork was incredibly dense, effectively masking the true origin of the capital. When the final signatures were executed and the massive digital transfers cleared, I sat in my office and opened the newly updated portfolio. I was officially the owner of the sprawling historic estate Liam's family used to project their false superiority. I held the primary liens on their failing commercial enterprises. I owned the debt that financed their luxury vehicles, their country club memberships, and the designer clothes they wore to masquerade as the elite. The irony was thick and immensely satisfying. My parents were wealthy African Americans who had spent their entire lives obsessed with high society appearances. They had treated me like a repulsive stain on their carefully curated image. They had discarded me in the freezing rain for a white man they believed was infinitely better than their own flesh and blood. They had bowed to his supposed old money lineage, practically throwing my sister at him to secure a proximity to power that they felt validated their own status. They were so blinded by their own class insecurities and desperate social climbing that they ignored every single red flag of a blatant financial grifter. Yet here I was, sitting in a custom-tailored suit in a penthouse thousands of miles away, holding the absolute legal right to foreclose on that very same power with a single phone call. I became their landlord and their primary creditor overnight. When Liam's father scrambled to make a minimum payment on their third mortgage to avoid defaulting, he was wiring those meager funds directly into my corporate accounts. When Liam swiped a credit card to pay for a lavish dinner to impress my sister, he was utilizing capital that I ultimately controlled. They were living, breathing, and functioning entirely at my mercy. I received the automated notification when the original banks transferred the servicing of their loans to my holding company. Liam's family likely thought it was a temporary blessing, assuming this faceless corporate entity would give them more time to restructure. They remained blissfully comfortably unaware that the college dropout sister they had thrown away was the invisible architect of their ongoing financial survival. I did not feel the urge to speed up their destruction. I did not call the loans in immediately or issue foreclosure notices the very next day. I am a venture capitalist. and I understand the profound strategic value of absolute patience. I knew their financial foundation was built on quicksand, and I was perfectly content to let them continue building their fragile house of cards higher and higher. I wanted to see exactly how far the deception would go. I watched their monthly financial statements roll across my desk, observing the frantic, desperate transfers of money between empty accounts. I saw the late fees accumulate and the penalties compound. Every red number on that spreadsheet was a testament to their arrogance. For months, I simply monitored the ledger. I went about my life expanding my business, traveling internationally, and securing my empire. I never checked my parents' social media. I never looked for updates on Jasmine or Liam. I did not need to. Their entire reality was documented in the financial reports my analysts delivered to me every single week. I knew exactly when Liam bought an engagement ring because I saw the fraudulent credit line spike. I knew exactly when they booked their luxury vacations because the data told me they were deliberately defaulting on their commercial property taxes just to afford the plane tickets. They were digging a grave so deep they would never be able to climb out. It was a clinical, emotionless operation. I had effectively neutralized the people who had terrorized my youth without ever having to look them in the eye or raise my voice. The frightened 23-year-old girl who had cried at the bus stop was completely gone. In her place was a woman who understood that true power does not need to announce itself in a crowded room. True power sits quietly in the shadows, holding the deed to the building. I had executed a flawless financial checkmate, and my opponents did not even realize the game was already over. They were just moving their pieces around a board I had already packed away. I decided to let the debt sit, to let the interest grow, and to wait for the exact perfect moment when gravity would inevitably pull them back down to earth. Until then, I would let them enjoy the illusion of their superiority while I owned the ground they walked on. 7 years is a massive amount of time to live in absolute silence. For 2,555 days, I existed entirely outside the orbit of my family. I did not receive a single birthday card. I did not get a single phone call checking to see if I was alive or dead. I was perfectly content with this arrangement. The silence was the ultimate luxury I had purchased with my departure. My empire grew, my investments compounded, and my peace remained entirely undisturbed. But toxic people possess a profound inability to leave well enough alone. A narcissist without an audience is exactly like a fire without oxygen. They eventually suffocate. For 7 years, Jasmine had been playing the role of the golden child, without her designated scapegoat standing in the background to provide the necessary contrast. She had nobody to look down upon. Without me there to absorb her manufactured drama and my parents' constant criticism, the foundation of their perfect family dynamic must have felt incredibly hollow. They needed their punching bag back. The bait arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 7 years after I left my house key on that marble kitchen island. I was sitting in my corner penthouse office, reviewing a quarterly earnings report, when my executive assistant stepped in. She handles all my communications, maintaining a ruthless corporate firewall that filters out anything that does not directly impact Apex Holdings. But this particular message had circumvented the corporate security protocols. It had bypassed the strict filters because it was sent to an incredibly old forwarding address I had set up during my college years. It was an email address I had not checked directly in nearly a decade, but it still routed to a secure catch-all inbox. My assistant printed the email and placed it gently on my desk, noting that it appeared to be a personal communication from someone claiming to be a relative. I looked at the sender name printed at the top of the page, Jasmine. I picked up the crisp white paper. The subject line was capitalized and highly demanding. It simply read, "Formal wedding invitation, Jasmine and Liam." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, feeling a sudden sharp spike of cold amusement. I had spent the last 2 years legally owning her fiancé's entire bloodline, waiting patiently for the inevitable collapse of their fraudulent finances. And here she was reaching out to me right on the precipice of their ultimate destruction. I read the email. It was not a message of reconciliation. It did not contain a single syllable of apology or a shred of genuine sisterly affection. It was a digital summons dripping with her signature brand of passive-aggressive superiority. It was expertly designed to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. Zuri, the email, began entirely omitting any standard greeting or polite inquiry about my well-being. Liam and I are finally tying the knot in what will undoubtedly be the social event of the season for Atlanta. Mom and Dad insisted we extend an invitation to you despite the incredibly dramatic and embarrassing way you abandoned your family. We assume you are still struggling to find your footing out there in the real world, but we are willing to be gracious. We want to give you the opportunity to witness this major milestone. We are getting married at the most exclusive botanical estate in the region. I let out a soft, cold laugh that echoed in the quiet expanse of my office. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words was almost mesmerizing. She truly believed she was extending a royal decree to a peasant. She honestly thought I was sitting in some rundown apartment scraping together pennies and regretting the day I walked away from their toxic wealth. She wanted me there for one specific reason. She wanted to parade her supposed billionaire husband in front of the sister who had absolutely nothing. She wanted to wear a designer gown and watch me sit in the corner, wearing whatever cheap clearance dress she assumed I could afford. She wanted the absolute unadulterated satisfaction of my envy. The entire invitation was a calculated psychological trap. Jasmine went on to describe Liam's family in glowing, reverent terms. She boasted about his parents' generational wealth and the prominent politicians who would be attending the ceremony. She explicitly stated that this was a blending of two powerful dynasties, and she expected me to behave accordingly. She warned me not to speak about my current living situation if it was depressing, because Liam's parents were highly refined people who did not want to be burdened with stories of financial struggle. The absolute blindness of her arrogance was staggering. She was marrying a white man whose father had literally begged my holding company for a loan extension just 3 weeks prior. She was boasting about blending dynasties with a family that was actively drowning in predatory debt that I personally controlled. But the most beautiful part of the email was the venue she named. She was bragging about securing the most exclusive botanical estate in the region to flaunt her non-existent wealth. That estate was a sprawling historic property featuring massive glass conservatories and acres of manicured gardens. It was also one of the absolute crown jewels in my commercial real estate portfolio. I had purchased that exact botanical estate under Apex Holdings 8 months prior, completely renovating its grand ballrooms and upgrading its security systems. I was literally her landlord. She was paying exorbitant venue fees directly into my corporate accounts to host a wedding funded by a fraudulent credit line that I also owned. I read the rest of the email. Jasmine instructed me to reply immediately because they were finalizing the high society guest list and could not leave a seat empty for someone who might flake. She included a strict dress code enforcing black tie attire while adding a snide comment that I should try my absolute best to find something appropriate so I would not stand out like a sore thumb among the elite guests. The email was a masterpiece of pure delusion. It perfectly encapsulated everything I had walked away from. The deep obsession with status, the pathetic need to belittle others to feel important, the complete detachment from reality. They had spent 7 years living in an echo chamber of their own arrogance, completely unaware that the world around them had entirely shifted. They did not know they were demanding a venture capital chief executive officer to attend a wedding funded by stolen money. They did not know the old money family they were trying so desperately to impress was entirely owned by the black sheep daughter they had discarded in the freezing rain. I placed the printed email down on my desk, smoothing out the creases with my hand. I did not feel a single ounce of the old anxiety that used to paralyze me when dealing with them. I did not feel the urge to cry or scream or defend my honor against her insults. I just felt a deep, calculating anticipation. The long game I had been quietly monitoring from the shadows was finally moving into the endgame phase. They had opened the door and eagerly invited the wolf directly into their home. I was still processing the sheer delusion of Jasmine's message when a second notification pinged on my screen. This one was sent directly from my mother. Valerie had apparently been copied on the initial email and felt the absolute need to add her own toxic stipulations. She could never let Jasmine fight her own battles or orchestrate her own manipulation. Valerie always had to step in and play the enforcer. I clicked open the message knowing exactly what kind of tone to expect. If Jasmine's email was a masterclass in passive-aggressive arrogance, my mother's email was a blatant exercise in cruel humiliation. Valerie did not bother with pleasantries or fake warmth. She operated under the firm, unwavering assumption that the last 7 years had completely broken me. She fully believed I was destitute, living paycheck to paycheck, and desperate for any crumb of family inclusion. She wrote to me as if she were a warden dictating terms to a paroled prisoner. She explicitly stated that allowing me back into their high society circle, even for a single weekend, was a massive risk to their reputation. She needed to make sure I understood exactly where I stood in the hierarchy before I dared to show my face in her presence. Then came the primary demand. The real reason they had hunted down my contact information after 7 years of comfortable silence. Valerie wrote that since I was attending the wedding, I was strictly required to bring our late grandmother's vintage diamond necklace. She did not ask me if I would be willing to lend it to my sister. She ordered me to hand it over. My grandmother was the only person in our family who ever looked at me and saw someone worthy of genuine respect. She was a strong, fiercely independent African-American woman who saw right through my parents' shallow obsession with country club status. When she passed away, she specifically willed her most valuable piece of jewelry to me. It was a stunning, heavy diamond piece from the 1940s that she had purchased with her own hard-earned money. My mother and sister had been absolutely furious when the will was read. They firmly believed the diamonds belonged on the golden child to be shown off at upscale parties. They had tried to manipulate me into giving it up back then, but I had secured that necklace in a safety deposit box the very day I left Atlanta. Valerie justified her demand with breathtaking entitlement. She wrote that the vintage diamonds fit Jasmine's bridal aesthetic perfectly. She stated that it was deeply selfish for a struggling dropout to hoard a luxury heirloom in some cheap apartment when Jasmine needed to look flawless for her billionaire groom. She told me to hand the necklace over the exact moment I arrived at the venue so it could be professionally cleaned before the ceremony. She phrased her demand as if I was merely a courier delivering stolen goods back to their rightful owner. She actually wrote that wearing the necklace would be my contribution to the wedding since she knew I could not afford to buy them a proper gift. But my mother was not finished setting her rules. She then presented what she clearly believed was an incredibly generous compromise regarding the rehearsal dinner. She informed me that the Friday night dinner was strictly reserved for their elite guests and Liam's distinguished family members. She wrote that I simply did not possess the wardrobe, the etiquette, or the social grace to mingle with people of that caliber. She warned that she would not risk me making a fool of myself or revealing my impoverished living situation to Liam's wealthy parents. She was terrified that my very existence would shatter the illusion of perfection she had spent years cultivating for her future in-laws. However, she offered me a way to attend. She told me I could come to the estate the night before the wedding, provided I agreed to work the coat check room. She actually typed the words you need to earn your keep. She instructed me to wear a plain black dress stand in the back corridor and assist the venue staff with taking jackets and holding umbrellas for the real guests. She wanted me completely out of sight, treating me as unpaid subservient labor. She thought she was doing me a massive favor by allowing me to breathe the same air as her distinguished guests, as long as I remained securely hidden in a closet holding their belongings. I sat in my quiet executive office digesting the sheer audacity of her words. The psychological cruelty was perfectly aligned with the woman who had abandoned me at a bus stop in the freezing rain. But my reaction remained entirely clinical. I felt my pulse steady and my mind sharpen. They wanted to strip me of the one single heirloom I possessed. They wanted to hide me in a back hallway to avoid embarrassing themselves in front of a family that was actively drowning in predatory debt. They wanted to force me to hold the coats of the very people whose financial survival depended entirely on my daily mercy. The irony was almost physically heavy in the room. They were demanding I work as an unpaid coat check attendant in a luxury botanical estate that I had purchased with my own capital. They were ordering me to act like a servant in a building where I legally held the deed. They were terrified I would embarrass them in front of a groom whose entire wedding was being funded by a line of credit that my firm personally owned and controlled. They were treating me like dirt while standing directly on the trapdoor I had built beneath their feet. I read the final line of my mother's email, where she warned me not to reply with any dramatic arguments and to simply confirm that I understood the rules. I did not reply with anger. I did not correct their assumptions about my wealth or my status. I realized that responding with the truth over an email would only ruin the masterpiece I was about to orchestrate. I needed them to believe their own lies right up until the final explosive moment of their destruction. I needed them to feel secure in their arrogance so the fall would completely break them. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor, reading the final demands from my mother. The sheer audacity of her instructions washed over me like a cold, refreshing wave. I did not draft a lengthy response defending my dignity. I did not list my accomplishments or attach a bank statement proving my net worth. I simply moved my cursor, hit reply, and typed a single word. Yes. I hit send before she could even close her laptop on the other end. The satisfaction of that one word was immense. I was giving them exactly what they wanted: complete subservience, total surrender. They needed to feel completely secure in their superiority so that the impending fall would shatter them beyond repair. I closed my email client and picked up my secure phone. I pressed the direct line to my head of private security, Isaiah. Isaiah was a towering, highly trained professional who had managed my personal safety since the early days of Apex Holdings. He knew my schedule, my habits, and my preference for absolute discretion. When he answered, I did not give him a typical itinerary. I told him we were going to a wedding in Atlanta, at the botanical estate our firm had purchased 8 months ago. I instructed him to mobilize a discreet extraction team and remain entirely off the radar until I gave a very specific verbal signal. Isaiah did not ask questions. He simply confirmed the orders and began his operational planning. Next, I called my executive assistant. I told her to bypass my usual black car service and rent a modest mid-size sedan. I wanted a standard, reliable vehicle that screamed lower middle-class struggle. Something 5 years old with fabric seats and a generic paint color. I needed to pull up to the valet stand looking like a woman who had counted her pennies just to afford the gas for the drive. The disguise required meticulous attention to detail. I left my penthouse and took a private elevator down to the street level. I bypassed the luxury boutiques and high-end ateliers I usually frequented. Instead, I directed my driver to take me to a discount department store on the outskirts of the city. Walking through the brightly lit aisles of synthetic fabrics and clearance racks, I felt a strange sense of nostalgic detachment. This was the world my parents thought I was trapped in. I found exactly what I was looking for on a heavily discounted rack. It was a shapeless, drab gray dress. The fabric was stiff and unapologetically cheap. It had a high neckline and long sleeves completely devoid of any elegance or modern tailoring. It was the physical embodiment of a woman who had given up. I bought it with cash along with a pair of scuffed-looking sensible flat shoes. I knew the moment my mother laid eyes on this outfit, her cruel heart would swell with vindictive joy. She would see the cheap polyester and immediately feel validated in her twisted narrative of my failure. Returning to my office, I shifted my focus to the most critical elements of my preparation. I opened my personal wall safe and retrieved a heavy velvet box. Inside lay my grandmother's vintage diamond necklace. The stones caught the ambient light, throwing brilliant flashes of fire across the dark room. My grandmother had worked tirelessly her entire life, enduring the systemic indignities of her era, to secure a piece of tangible, lasting wealth. She had willed it to me because she recognized my resilience. She knew I would not wear it as a cheap status symbol to impress country club socialites. I ran my fingers over the intricate gold clasp. My mother and sister wanted to strip this from me to complete Jasmine's bridal aesthetic. They wanted to take the legacy of a strong, hardworking African-American woman and drape it over the neck of a superficial bride marrying into a fraudulent white family. I closed the velvet box with a sharp snap. I would wear the necklace to the rehearsal dinner. I would let them see it sparkle against my cheap gray dress. It would be the ultimate bait. The final piece of my preparation was the weaponry. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk and pulled out a sleek black leather briefcase. This briefcase would hold the keys to their complete financial and social destruction. I carefully arranged the legal documents inside. First, I placed the official property deed for the botanical estate clearly showing Apex Holdings as the sole legal owner. Next, I added the finalized debt acquisition papers detailing the catastrophic financial ruin of Liam's family. Every defaulted mortgage, every predatory corporate loan, and every fraudulent line of credit was meticulously highlighted. The crowning document was a formal notice of immediate loan recall. My legal team had drafted it with lethal precision. It explicitly stated that the $150,000 credit line utilized to fund this lavish wedding weekend was being recalled due to severe contractual violations and gross misrepresentation of assets. I secured the heavy brass latches of the briefcase. I handed it directly to Isaiah with strict instructions to keep it locked in his armored vehicle until the exact moment I summoned him to the ballroom floor. The psychological preparation was the heaviest task of all. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse watching the city lights flicker to life. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I was about to subject myself to a barrage of microaggressions, outright insults, and deep emotional manipulation. I would have to stand in a back hallway holding the expensive coats of people whose entire existence was funded by my capital. I would have to listen to my father call me a failure and watch my mother look at me with raw, unfiltered disgust. I would have to endure Liam's arrogant boasting and Jasmine's relentless mockery. I closed my eyes and built a mental fortress. I locked away my pride, my ego, and my status as a billionaire chief executive. I needed to be a ghost. I needed to be a mirror, reflecting their own ugliness back at them without absorbing a single drop of their poison. I practiced my submissive posture. I practiced lowering my gaze and keeping my voice soft and hesitant. I would let them push me into the shadows. I would let them laugh and gloat and celebrate their fabricated superiority. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The frightened 23-year-old girl who had cried in the rain was completely gone. The woman staring back at me was an apex predator patiently waiting in the tall grass. The trap was set. The bait was polished. The execution was perfectly choreographed. I turned away from the window and grabbed my cheap gray dress. It was time to go home. The drive took 40 minutes from my downtown penthouse to the sprawling, lush perimeter of the city. I gripped the plastic steering wheel of the rented mid-sized sedan, feeling the slight rattle in the engine. The car smelled faintly of artificial pine air freshener and stale coffee. It was the perfect chariot for the pathetic, defeated character I was about to play. I turned onto the private, winding road leading to the botanical estate. Massive historic oak trees draped in thick Spanish moss formed a natural canopy overhead, shielding the property from the outside world. I approached the towering wrought iron gates, where a security guard in a crisp, dark uniform stepped out of the booth holding an electronic tablet. I rolled down the manual window and gave him my name. He swiped his screen, nodded without a second glance, and pressed a button to open the heavy gates. He had absolutely no idea that his paycheck, his health benefits, and his pension were entirely funded by the signature I scrawled on a corporate payroll authorization form every 2 weeks. I drove up the sweeping circular driveway approaching the Grand Conservatory. The valet stand was already crowded with a chaotic mix of vehicles. Gleaming black luxury sedans, imported sports cars, and vintage convertibles sat in perfect organized rows. I pulled my drab, sputtering rental car right up to the front. The young valet attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning my cheap vehicle before politely opening my door. I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway, and the thick, humid Georgia evening air immediately clung to the stiff polyester of my gray dress. The fabric was unforgiving and aggressively unflattering, designed specifically to make me look like a woman who had completely surrendered to a life of quiet financial desperation. But resting heavily against my collarbone was my grandmother's vintage diamond necklace. The brilliant antique stones caught the ambient light from the carriage lanterns, casting sharp, bright fractures of light across the driveway. It was the only authentic piece of luxury on my body, and it commanded absolute, undeniable attention. I walked up the wide marble steps and pushed through the heavy brass doors of the conservatory. The interior was visually breathtaking. I knew exactly how much it cost to achieve this aesthetic because I had personally approved the massive renovation budget 8 months ago. Apex Holdings had purchased the failing historic property out of foreclosure and injected millions of dollars into its structural and cosmetic restoration. I had signed off on the imported Italian marble flooring currently beneath my cheap flat shoes. I had authorized the installation of the massive climate-controlled glass atrium arching 50 feet above the main ballroom. I had even approved the specific boutique vendor who supplied the thousands of rare white orchids cascading dynamically from the vaulted ceiling. I was walking into a magnificent commercial masterpiece of my own creation, but to the hundreds of guests mingling in the room, I was merely an underdressed trespasser who had stumbled through the wrong entrance. The room buzzed with the practiced laughter and orchestrated networking of Atlanta high society. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women in designer silk gowns held crystal champagne flutes, trading empty compliments and sizing each other up. I spotted Liam's family near the absolute center of the room. They were holding court, projecting a loud, boisterous aura of generational wealth that I knew for a documented fact was entirely fabricated. They laughed loudly, sipping top-shelf imported liquor paid for by a fraudulent high-interest credit line that my holding company legally owned. I stood near the entrance, absorbing the incredible dramatic irony of the entire situation. I was a ghost, haunting my own castle, watching parasites feast on a table I had set. I did not even have the chance to fully step into the ballroom before they descended upon me. My parents, Andre and Valerie, materialized from the crowded room, moving with the swift, aggressive coordination of predators spotting a wounded animal. They did not greet me with a smile. They did not offer a stiff, polite hug, or even a basic acknowledgement of the 7 years that had passed since they threw me out into the freezing rain. Valerie reached me first. Her eyes locked instantly onto my drab gray dress, and her face immediately contorted into a mask of pure visceral disgust. She looked me up and down as if I had just tracked raw sewage across her pristine floors. "What in the world are you wearing?" She hissed, her voice a harsh, frantic whisper, designed specifically to avoid drawing attention from the surrounding affluent guests. "You look like a maid who wandered out of the servant quarters. I explicitly told you to make an effort, Zuri. You are a walking absolute disaster." My father, Andre, stepped out from behind her, looming over me with his broad, intimidating shoulders. He wore a tight custom tuxedo that strained slightly against his chest. His eyes were completely cold and devoid of any paternal warmth or relief at seeing his eldest daughter. "We knew you would pull something pathetic like this," he muttered, shaking his head in profound, aggressive disappointment. 7 years, and you have not changed a single bit. You are still looking for attention by playing the miserable victim. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family and to this event. Before I could offer a single word of defense, Valerie reached out and dug her manicured nails violently into my forearm. Her grip was punishing and entirely controlling, forcing me to move off balance. Andre flanked my other side, using his large body to physically shield me from the view of the main ballroom. They aggressively herded me away from the sparkling chandeliers and the laughing guests, pushing me forcefully toward the heavy wooden doors that led to the service corridors. "Keep your head down," Valerie commanded, dragging me down a narrow, dimly lit hallway that smelled heavily of industrial cleaning supplies and roasted catering meat. They did not stop marching until we reached a small, cramped alcove near the kitchen entrance. It was the coat check room, a windowless, claustrophobic space lined with industrial metal racks and cheap plastic hangers. Valerie released my arm roughly and shoved a heavy roll of numbered plastic claim tickets directly into my chest. "You will stand right here," she ordered, pointing a sharp, trembling finger at the small wooden counter. You will take the coats, you will hang the umbrellas, and you will not utter a single word to anyone unless you are handing them a numbered ticket. Andre leaned in, closing the physical distance between us, until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. Let me make this perfectly clear, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing, gravelly tone. Liam's parents are out in that ballroom. They are distinguished, wealthy people who actually know how to build a lasting legacy. You are not to speak to them. You are not to make eye contact with them. You are not to wander into the main hall and ruin your sister's perfect evening by reminding everyone that we have a high school dropout for a daughter. You are here to work and earn your keep. Do you understand me? I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. Their faces were twisted with a profound, arrogant cruelty that had not softened over the span of 7 years. They were so deeply blinded by their desperate need for social validation that they could not see the devastating reality staring them right in the face. They truly thought they were banishing a complete failure to the shadows. They did not realize they were commanding a billionaire chief executive to work the coat check in a building she held the legal deed to. I kept my posture completely submissive. I allowed my shoulders to slump slightly, and I lowered my gaze, focusing intently on the scuffed toes of my cheap, sensible shoes. I understand, I said, my voice soft and perfectly compliant. I will stay right here out of sight. Valerie let out a sharp, disgusted sigh, adjusting the sparkling straps of her evening gown. Just do your job and stay hidden, she snapped. She turned on her heel, her gown catching the harsh fluorescent light of the service hallway. Andre followed right behind her, casting one last look of sheer, absolute contempt in my direction, before the heavy wooden doors swung shut, leaving me completely alone in the coat room. I stood in the quiet, narrow corridor, holding the roll of red plastic claim tickets. The faint, muffled sound of the string quartet drifted through the thick walls. I reached up and touched the cool, heavy diamonds of my grandmother's necklace, resting securely against my collarbone. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. They had played their roles flawlessly. They had delivered every insult and every slight with textbook precision, confirming that they had not changed and did not deserve a single ounce of mercy. They had forcefully pushed me into the dark, completely unaware that I was the one controlling the master breaker switch. I took my place behind the wooden coat check counter, perfectly content to wait in the shadows, while the clock ticked down to their absolute public destruction. I stood in the dim corridor for what felt like an eternity, watching the elite guests hand over their silk wraps and cashmere jackets. I took their items with a polite nod, slipping the numbered plastic tags into their manicured hands. I was completely invisible to them. They looked right through me, seeing only the drab gray polyester and my lowered gaze. It was the perfect camouflage. The rehearsal dinner was in full swing. The heavy oak doors separating the coat room from the main conservatory muffled the clinking glasses and the string quartet, but the arrogant, booming laughter of the groom cut through the noise with distinct clarity. Liam pushed through the heavy doors a few minutes later, holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. His face was flushed with expensive liquor and unearned confidence. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that was cut just a fraction too tight, a desperate attempt to project an imposing physical presence. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed the entire world existed solely to cater to his whims. He was flanked by 2 groomsmen who looked like exact replicas of his entitled country club persona. He spotted me standing behind the wooden counter and stopped dead in his tracks. A slow, malicious grin spread across his face. He nudged his groomsmen and pointed his glass directly at me. He sauntered over, closing the distance between us with heavy, deliberate steps. His gaze swept over my plain gray dress and the sensible flat shoes I wore. Well, 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 he drawled, his voice loud and dripping with patronizing amusement. The prodigal sister finally decides to show her face. Jasmine warned me you were struggling out there in the real world, but looking at you right now, I realized she was actually being generous. This is just profoundly sad, Zuri. I kept my hands folded neatly on the wooden counter and lowered my chin, playing the role of the defeated sibling. I did not offer a single word of defense. My silence only fueled his massive ego. He leaned against the counter, invading my personal space. The smell of high-proof bourbon and expensive generic cologne washed over me. "You should be taking detailed notes tonight," he mocked, gesturing widely toward the conservatory doors. "You are standing in the most exclusive botanical estate in the region. I am dropping $150,000 on this wedding weekend alone. My family demands absolute perfection, and I am more than happy to provide it. This is what it looks like when you marry into true generational wealth. I am giving your sister the kind of life you could not even dream of achieving." He took a long, arrogant sip from his crystal tumbler, ice clinking against the glass. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial sneer. "Jasmine finally has a real man with real money to take care of her. She does not have to worry about scraping by or making the kind of pathetic life choices you made. You abandoned your family because you were too weak to meet their standards. Now you are back standing in a hallway holding the coats of people who actually matter. It is a fitting punishment. You are a charity case, Zuri. We are letting you breathe this air out of pure pity." I looked at the floor, absorbing his insults with cold, analytical precision. The sheer breathtaking irony of his entire speech was almost difficult to process. He was boasting about spending $150,000 on a single weekend. I knew exactly where that money came from. I had personally reviewed the financial forensics of his failing family estate. That money was drawn from a fraudulent high-interest credit line secured by a dummy corporation his father had set up 3 months prior. His family was entirely bankrupt. They were actively drowning in a sea of predatory debt, and the holding company that owned every single cent of that debt was Apex Holdings. Liam was standing inside a luxury venue that I legally owned, bragging about spending money that he had effectively stolen from my corporate accounts. He was a complete financial parasite trying to lecture the apex predator about wealth. I felt a deep, quiet thrill settle into my chest. He was digging his own grave with every arrogant syllable that left his mouth, and I was perfectly content to hand him a bigger shovel. I nodded submissively, clutching the roll of plastic claim tickets tightly in my hand, as if his cruel words had deeply wounded my pride. His groomsmen chuckled, tossing their expensive jackets onto the counter. Liam tossed his own jacket over my arm, treating me exactly like the unpaid servant my parents intended me to be. "Try not to ruin the fabric," he sneered. "It costs more than you make in a year." Before I could even hang the jacket on the metal rack, the heavy oak doors swung open again. Jasmine marched into the corridor, flanked by 4 bridesmaids wearing matching champagne-colored silk dresses. My sister was the absolute center of attention, radiating an intense, manic energy. She wore a rehearsal gown that trailed heavily along the floor, entirely unsuited for the humid Georgia evening, but perfectly aligned with her desperate need to be the most important person in any room. She saw Liam standing at the coat check counter, and her eyes immediately darted to me. The cruel, triumphant smile that erupted on her face was identical to our mother's. She glided over, wrapping her arm possessively around Liam's waist while staring me down. Her bridesmaids clustered behind her, whispering and giggling behind their manicured hands. "I see you found the coat, girl," Jasmine announced, her voice echoing sharply in the narrow hallway. She looked me up and down, performing the exact same visual assessment our mother had executed earlier. "I told you she would show up looking like a disaster, Liam. I tried to warn you. Mom was right to hide her back here. We cannot have the photographers capturing this tragedy in the background of our perfect evening." Liam kissed her cheek heavily. "Do not worry about her, babe. She is exactly where she belongs. She is learning how the other half lives." Jasmine stepped away from Liam and closed the distance to the wooden counter. She leaned over the surface, her eyes locking onto my collarbone. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the service corridor caught the brilliant fire of my grandmother's vintage diamond necklace. The antique stones sparkled fiercely against the dull gray polyester of my dress. Jasmine's expression shifted instantly from smug superiority to burning aggressive entitlement. Her eyes narrowed and her jaw tightened. "I cannot believe you actually had the audacity to wear that necklace tonight," she hissed, her voice losing its mocking lilt and turning venomous. "Mom specifically emailed you the rules, Zuri. You were supposed to bring it to me so I could have it professionally cleaned for the ceremony tomorrow. It perfectly matches my bridal aesthetic. You are standing in a service hallway, looking like absolute trash. A charity case has no business wearing vintage diamonds. It is a complete insult to Grandma's memory. She did not wait for my response. Jasmine was so profoundly accustomed to my compliance, so deeply conditioned to believe that I would simply surrender to her demands that she did not even ask me to take it off. She reached her hand straight across the wooden counter, her fingers outstretched, attempting to physically unhook the delicate gold clasp directly from the back of my neck. She intended to strip the only heirloom I possessed right off my body in front of her laughing friends and her arrogant groom. She expected me to flinch. She expected me to lower my head and let her take it, just like she had taken my high school graduation, my college send-off, and my 23rd birthday. She expected the broken 23-year-old girl who cried at the bus stop. She reached for my neck, but she never made contact. I stepped back with lightning speed, my posture snapping from submissive to rigidly upright in a fraction of a second. I raised my left hand and struck her wrist with a sharp, forceful block, slapping her hand entirely away from my body. The sound of the impact echoed loudly in the small corridor. The giggling from the bridesmaids stopped instantly. Liam spilled a drop of his bourbon on his custom shoes. Jasmine gasped, cradling her wrist and staring at me in absolute profound shock. The air in the room changed completely. The heavy, suffocating act I had been playing all evening dissolved into nothing. I dropped the roll of plastic claim tickets onto the counter and stood at my full height. I looked Jasmine dead in the eyes, and all the warmth, all the hesitant compliance I had feigned, was replaced by pure glacial ice. The time for playing the helpless victim was permanently over. The trap was fully sprung, and the heavy steel doors were locking shut behind them. "Do not ever touch me," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, ringing with terrifying quiet authority. Jasmine took a shaky step backward, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine fear. The woman standing across the counter was no longer the sister she knew. She was staring directly at a chief executive who dismantled corporations for a living. I smoothed the front of my gray dress and adjusted the diamond necklace, letting the stones settle perfectly against my collarbone. I looked at Liam, whose arrogant sneer had melted into confused apprehension. "I think it is time for the dinner toasts," I announced, staring right through them. I turned my back on the coat room, pushed past the stunned bridesmaids, and walked with absolute precision toward the grand conservatory doors. I was going to take the microphone, and I was going to burn their entire fabricated world straight to the ground. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out of the suffocating service corridor. The grand conservatory hit me with a wall of sound and light. The string quartet was playing a classical rendition of a popular symphony. Crystal glasses clinked continuously. The elite guests of Atlanta society mingled in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, my cheap gray dress standing out like a sharp, jagged rock in a sea of smooth silk. Valerie and Andre spotted me almost immediately. They were standing near the main bar, laughing with a local politician. When my mother saw me marching past the invisible boundary she had drawn for me, the champagne flute in her hand visibly shook. She excused herself with a tight, frantic smile and grabbed my father's arm. They moved to intercept me, their faces twisting into identical masks of panicked rage. "Zuri, what are you doing?" Valerie hissed, her voice a harsh, desperate whisper as she reached out to grab my arm. "Get back in the hallway right now." I did not stop walking. I did not even look at her. I simply sidestepped her grasping hand with the fluid grace of someone who was entirely untouchable. I kept my eyes fixed on the small, elevated stage at the front of the room, where a lone microphone stood waiting for the scheduled dinner toasts. Andre tried to step in front of me, using his broad shoulders to block my path. "You are crossing a very dangerous line," he growled, his tone dropping to a threatening, gravelly pitch. "If you take one more step and embarrass us in front of these people, you will regret it for the rest of your pathetic life." I looked up at my father, meeting his furious gaze with absolute freezing calm. "You do not have the power to make me regret anything anymore," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a lethal edge that made him physically recoil. I stepped around him and climbed the two small wooden steps onto the stage. I reached out and grasped the cool metal stem of the microphone. I tapped the top of it twice. The sharp percussive thud echoed through the massive glass atrium, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low murmur of hundreds of wealthy guests faded into a tense, heavy silence. Every single face in the grand ballroom turned to look at the woman in the cheap gray polyester dress standing on the stage. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jasmine and Liam burst through the service corridor doors. Jasmine was clutching her wrist, her face flushed with furious manic energy. Liam trailed closely behind her, his arrogant sneer replaced by deep confusion. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw me commanding the room. "Good evening, everyone." I began, my voice projecting smoothly and confidently across the silent conservatory. "I know many of you are wondering why I am standing up here. You are probably looking at my plain gray dress and wondering how a coat check attendant managed to hijack the microphone." I let a small, cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Zuri," I continued. "I am Jasmine's older sister." The room erupted in a sudden wave of frantic whispering. Guests exchanged shocked glances, looking from me to my parents. Valerie and Andre stood frozen in horror, their carefully constructed narrative of my absence completely shattering in real time. I raised my free hand, and the whispers died down immediately. "My parents have likely told you that I am a struggling dropout. They probably told you I was working overseas, or that I was too busy failing at life to attend family events. They have spent the last 7 years erasing me from their perfect high society image because I refused to bow down to their toxic, conditional demands. They completely disowned me and cast me out into the rain with $14 to my name." Jasmine marched toward the front of the stage, her face twisted with absolute fury. "Turn that microphone off and get out of my rehearsal dinner, you psycho!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "You are a jealous charity case, and you are ruining my weekend." I looked down at my sister, feeling nothing but profound clinical pity. "I am not a charity case, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm that demanded total attention. "And I am not just the sister you tried to hide in a back hallway tonight." I shifted my gaze to the center of the room, locking eyes with Liam's wealthy white parents who were standing near the head table. They looked deeply uncomfortable, entirely unprepared for this level of public family drama. "My name is Zuri," I repeated, letting the syllables ring clear and true. "But in the corporate financial sector, I am known by a different title. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." The name dropped into the room like a heavy lead weight. Liam's father gasped audibly, taking a staggering step backward. His mother dropped her evening clutch, the small beaded purse hitting the marble floor with a sharp clatter. They knew that name. Every person in the room who operated in the high-stakes commercial real estate and private equity sectors knew the name of the ruthless holding company that had been aggressively acquiring assets across the South. My father, Andre, looked bewildered. The blood drained entirely from his face as his brain struggled to reconcile the massive, terrifying reality of my statement with the pathetic image of the daughter he thought he had broken. Valerie covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with mounting terror. I did not give them a single second to process the revelation. I turned my attention to the back of the room, where the venue audio-visual team was stationed at a large mixing board. These were my employees. They answered directly to my corporate management structure. I gave the lead technician a sharp, definitive nod. The massive high-definition media screens positioned around the ballroom suddenly flickered to life. These screens were originally intended to display a romantic slideshow of Jasmine and Liam playing a fabricated timeline of their perfect fake relationship. Instead, the screens illuminated the room with the harsh, unforgiving glow of highly confidential legal documents. The crowd turned their attention to the digital displays. The first document, projected in massive, crisp black text, was the official property deed for the very botanical estate we were currently standing inside. I had specifically instructed the AV team to highlight the ownership section in bright yellow. I know Jasmine and Liam have spent this entire evening boasting to all of you about the incredible expense of this luxury venue, I said, pacing slowly across the stage. Liam specifically told me earlier tonight that he was dropping $150,000 to secure the perfect aesthetic for this wedding. I pointed toward the glowing screens. But if you direct your attention to the legal deed currently displayed, you will notice something quite interesting. This historic property was purchased out of foreclosure 8 months ago. The sole legal owner of this estate is Apex Holdings. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. The realization washed over the crowd with terrifying speed. I was not a trespassing coat check attendant. I was the absolute legal owner of the ground they were standing on. I watched Jasmine's face contort in sheer unadulterated horror. She looked at the screens reading my corporate entity listed as the owner, and her knees visibly buckled. As the legal owner of this venue, I feel it is my strict fiduciary duty to inform all of you about a sudden change in the itinerary. I continued, my voice ringing with lethal authority. I am officially canceling the booking for tomorrow's wedding ceremony. Valerie let out a strangled, agonizing cry. She rushed toward the stage, reaching her hands up toward me like a beggar. Zuri, please, she wailed, abandoning all pretense of high society dignity. You cannot do this. We have politicians here. We have judges here. You are embarrassing us in front of everyone. You embarrassed yourselves the moment you decided to treat your own flesh and blood like disposable garbage, I replied, staring coldly down at her. I am simply holding you accountable. The wedding is permanently cancelled, effective immediately due to a severe breach of conduct and massive outstanding debts. Liam stepped forward, his face a mask of furious, arrogant denial. You cannot cancel my wedding, he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the stage. I paid the venue deposit. I hold a signed contract. My family is paying for this entire weekend, and we will sue you for every single penny you have. I looked at Liam and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey willingly walk into the slaughterhouse. I had waited 7 long years for this exact moment. I had built an empire in the dark specifically to burn his fraudulent world to the ground in the light. You are not going to sue anyone, Liam, I said softly, leaning into the microphone so the entire room could hear the final nail being driven into his coffin. Because you do not actually have any money. I pressed the small black button on the remote resting in my palm. The massive screens behind me instantly shifted. The property deed vanished, replaced by pages of heavily redacted but unmistakably damning financial forensics. The bold, undeniable crest of Apex Holdings sat at the very top of the debt acquisition portfolio. You see, Liam, I am not just a landlord. I projected into the microphone, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated silence of the room. I am a venture capitalist, and my firm specializes in acquiring distressed, highly toxic assets. 3 months ago, my acquisitions team flagged your family trust. I watched the last remaining drops of color drain from Liam's face. His jaw trembled uncontrollably. The crystal tumbler of bourbon slipped from his fingers, shattering violently against the imported Italian marble floor. The sharp crash made Jasmine flinch, but I did not stop speaking. I was dismantling his entire universe syllable by syllable. Your generational wealth is a complete fabrication, I announced to the hundreds of wide-eyed guests. Your historic family businesses have been bleeding capital for 6 consecutive years. You are surviving entirely on predatory loans and fraudulent corporate credit lines. That $150,000 budget you have been bragging about all evening was secured through a dummy corporation using grossly inflated assets. I pointed directly at his chest. Apex Holdings bought every single one of your family's outstanding loans for pennies on the dollar. We own the mortgages on your estate. We own the liens on your failing businesses. And as your primary creditor, I am executing the contractual clause to recall the wedding credit line in full effective immediately due to gross misrepresentation of assets. Sheer unprecedented chaos erupted in the conservatory. The high society guests, people who guarded their reputations with ruthless paranoia, recoiled as if Liam had a highly contagious disease. Polite whispers turned into loud, furious gasps. The illusion of perfection was dead. I looked toward the back of the room where Liam's parents had been standing just moments before. They did not attempt to defend their son. They did not march up to the stage to salvage their pride or demand an explanation. The shame of being publicly exposed as financial frauds to the entire Atlanta elite was far too absolute. They simply turned on their heels and practically sprinted toward the brass doors, abandoning the rehearsal dinner and fleeing into the humid night to escape the burning, judging stares of their peers. Jasmine let out a piercing, agonizing shriek. The illusion of her billionaire lifestyle shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. She looked at Liam not with love or concern, but with raw, unadulterated disgust. She realized in that exact moment that she had manipulated our parents, alienated me, and sold her soul for a man who owed his very existence to the sister she had just tried to strip of a necklace. She clawed at the fabric of her expensive rehearsal gown, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of her impending poverty crashed down on her shoulders. Then came the most pathetic display of all. Andre and Valerie, completely humiliated and watching their social standing incinerate before their eyes, desperately scrambled to salvage a lifeline. Their survival instincts kicked in entirely devoid of any genuine maternal or paternal love. They realized the golden ticket was not Jasmine, it was me. Valerie pushed her way to the front of the stage, her hands clasped together in a frantic, pleading gesture. Her face stretched into a grotesque, panicked smile. "Zuri, sweetheart," she cried out, her voice loud enough for the whispering guests to hear. "We are so incredibly proud of you. We always knew you were our successful daughter. We just pushed you so hard because we saw your limitless potential. Please let us handle this family business privately." Andre stepped up right beside her, nodding vigorously, trying to project the image of a proud, protective patriarch. "Your mother is right. You have proven yourself today. You are an absolute triumph, Zuri. We are a unified family. Let us go to the executive suite and sort out Liam's mess together." I looked down at them, feeling a profound clinical emptiness. There was no anger left in my heart. There was only the satisfying finality of a perfectly executed surgical strike. I brought the microphone back to my lips, holding their desperate gazes. "We are not a family," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. "You threw me out into the freezing rain with $14 to my name. You spent 7 years pretending I did not exist. And tonight you tried to hide me in a coat check room so I would not embarrass you in front of a man who is actively bankrupt." I shook my head slowly, rejecting their existence entirely. "You do not get to claim my success when you contributed absolutely nothing but trauma. You do not get to call me your daughter when you treated me like disposable garbage. I am publicly and permanently disowning both of you." I lowered the microphone and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the back of the room. Marcus, my towering head of private security, stepped out from the shadows. He was flanked by 4 other massive, highly trained security guards, dressed in sleek tactical suits. They moved through the murmuring crowd with lethal, coordinated efficiency. "Please escort these individuals off my property immediately," I instructed, pointing a steady, unwavering finger at my parents, my shrieking sister, and her fraudulent groom. The elite guests parted like the Red Sea, making way for my security team. Marcus and his men expertly and firmly guided them toward the exit, giving them no room to resist. Valerie kicked and wailed, her sequined gown glittering under the fairy lights, as she was marched forcefully away. Andre tried to puff out his chest and demand respect, but a single stern physical block from Marcus deflated him entirely. Jasmine sobbed hysterically, stumbling over her designer heels, while Liam trailed behind them in a state of absolute defeated shock. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind them, sealing them out in the dark. I stood alone on the stage, the undisputed owner of the room, as a perfect, absolute silence settled over my new empire. The silence in the grand conservatory lasted for a full minute after the heavy brass doors locked shut. I stepped down from the stage, handed the microphone to my lead audio-visual technician, and walked out through the main entrance. I did not stay to watch the elite guests of Atlanta society scramble for the valet stand in a state of absolute shock. My work was completely finished and my empire was secure. The fallout the next morning was swift, brutal, and profoundly satisfying. The opulent wedding ceremony never happened. The massive catering orders were redirected to local food banks by my estate management team, and the thousands of rare white orchids were dismantled and donated. Jasmine and Liam's relationship imploded with the terrifying speed and violence of a collapsing star. Without the illusion of generational wealth to cushion his massive ego, Liam turned incredibly vicious. He blamed my parents for the public humiliation and severed all ties with Jasmine before the weekend was even over. Apex Holdings officially foreclosed on his family estate 30 days later. We aggressively liquidated their failing commercial assets, auctioned off their leased luxury vehicles, and stripped them of their remaining unearned dignity. Liam was forced to move into a cramped rental property on the outskirts of the city, entirely dependent on a basic entry-level salary to survive. Jasmine, realizing she had alienated her only successful sibling for a man who was mathematically destitute, suffered a total psychological collapse. She had no billionaire groom, no high society status, and no golden child pedestal left to stand upon. When she tried to run back to Andre and Valerie for emotional support, they completely turned on her. They blamed Jasmine for bringing a financial fraud into their lives and ruining their pristine reputation, fracturing their toxic triad forever. Jasmine was eventually forced to take a low-level retail job at a local mall, ringing up the exact designer clothes she used to flaunt. Andre and Valerie faced a fate far worse than simple financial ruin. They faced absolute social death. The elite circles of Atlanta are famously unforgiving when it comes to public humiliation and fraudulent wealth. The story of my rehearsal dinner takeover spread through their beloved country club network like wildfire. The prominent politicians and wealthy executives they had spent decades trying to impress completely blacklisted them. Their country club membership was quietly but firmly revoked, preventing them from ever showing their faces in polite society again. The overwhelming shame and isolation drove them out of their sprawling suburban mansion. They were forced to downsize to a modest townhouse in an unremarkable zip code, entirely stripped of the audience they desperately needed to survive. They attempted to reach out to my corporate office several times, sending frantic apologetic letters begging for financial assistance and reconciliation. My legal team responded with ironclad cease and desist orders, threatening immediate harassment charges if they ever tried to contact me again. The silence that followed was absolute and permanent. Now, 12 years after I walked out into that freezing rain, I am 35 years old. I am standing on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my own penthouse, breathing in the cool, crisp evening air. The glittering skyline of the city stretches out before me, a vast, beautiful landscape of illuminated concrete and steel that my holding company helped shape. The night is perfectly quiet high above the chaotic noise of the streets below. Resting securely against my collarbone is my grandmother's vintage diamond necklace. The antique stones catch the ambient light from the city, reminding me of the fierce, hard-working woman who paved the way for my survival. I reach up and trace the intricate gold clasp, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of absolute peace. The heavy, crushing weight of my past has been entirely, completely lifted. I turn away from the city lights and look through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors into my living room. The space is filled with warm, golden light and the rich, beautiful sound of genuine laughter. My business partners, my loyal friends, and the colleagues who stood by me when I had absolutely nothing are gathered around my kitchen island. They are pouring expensive wine-sharing stories and celebrating our latest successful acquisition. This is my chosen family. They do not care about my net worth, and they do not demand my subservience to validate their own fragile egos. They love and respect me unconditionally for my mind, my resilience, and my character. I built this sanctuary brick by brick, replacing the toxic foundation of my youth with unshakable loyalty and truth. I am no longer the scapegoat or the forgotten sister. I am the architect of my own destiny. I take one last deep breath of the night air, savoring the incredible weightless freedom of a life entirely under my own control. I step back inside, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind me, ready to join the people who actually matter. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who don't leave you stranded with the bill. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of taking back your power. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Toxic family dynamics often condition us to accept less than we deserve, masking abuse as love and control as guidance. Breaking free requires the immense courage to walk away into the unknown and build a foundation on your own terms. True power is not about seeking revenge or proving your abusers wrong loudly. It is about cultivating your success in absolute silence and creating a life so rich with genuine chosen relationships that their conditional approval no longer matters. If you are ready to stop shrinking to fit into spaces you have outgrown and start taking back your power, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.